When you bear in mind that 70% of people leave a job because of an issue with management, the effect that management has on productivity is huge. And how often is that looked at? Hardly ever. The science is really consistent. We have never found a place where people are too happy or too unstressed. Those things always correlate with better performance.
Hello, workplace innovators of the world. Welcome back to Workplace Visionaries, a podcast that gets real about the present and future of how people work. I'm Jane Young from Hubstar, and in this episode I'm joined by my co-host, Joe Harris, in a conversation with Dr. Craig Knight. And it's a conversation that made me realise just how wrong current thinking is about productivity. It's like the world's stuck in this centuries-long dystopian scientific management hangover. And this means we're still measuring productivity all wrong. Only it's worse than that because our attempts at improving productivity can actually make it worse. So we're wrecking human well-being, motivation, creativity, and damaging company performance and results. We also get into just how badly leaders are underestimating the impact of choice. Not just giving people choice in when and where they work, but having people really deeply involved in the design of the physical spaces. So I think you're going to love this conversation with Craig, whom I've heard described as a wizard of superb workplaces. Not only is he a doctor of organisational psychology and founder of Identity Realisation, but he's figured out how to get some incredible results like increasing well-being by 50%, productivity by 32%, and even intelligence by up to 19%. So don't miss this one. It's full of insight, practical takeaways for anyone figuring out their workplace strategy. Thanks for listening. Dr. Craig Knight, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you for taking the time to be here. We really appreciate it. I was reading an article of yours that was published in Scientific American Mind.
Oh, yes.
And I thought I'd kick off by reading a little excerpt from that because it did amuse me. So here goes. Anyone who's had to walk past his boss's desk to get to or leave his own, or whose computer is positioned in such a way that she knows her manager could appear any moment and, peering over her shoulder, see exactly what she's doing, will find it interesting to learn that the designers of open plan workplaces borrowed from a concept called the Panopticon. Developed in 1785 by utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, this circular prison featured a central tower from which guards could monitor the inmates without themselves being seen. This was an efficient form of control in that a small number of jailers could keep all the prisoners on edge. The inmates would never know when they were or were not being observed. So, Craig, how far do you think we've come in the land of workplace since 1785?
Oh, that depends who you're talking about, really. For those people at the top of the chain, John called Paul Burrell in 2004 called the privileged, self-monitored, self-managed few, we're fine. We're okay. We're good. The people that can, I suppose, listen to this podcast. But for the poor devils further down the chain, the ones that typically, for example, sit in call centres, not an inch forward. The point of a panopticon applies just as much to a call centre, where people are monitored and watched to within an inch of their job without knowing whether they're being watched or not, just as those warders used to watch the prisoners. That principle is exactly the same now as it was, 250 years ago.
What do you think about the whole productivity thing, and you know, how far can we go too far with that?
Productivity. Well, I mean, we'll probably come back to productivity anyway, but let's stick with that as a starting point. And those call centres, because people in call centres are monitored to within an inch of their life because things are measured. They want to know, for example, how long somebody takes to answer a call, how long somebody is on that call, and how long somebody takes to do the administration associated with that call. Because the more calls you put through, the more productive you are. So the most productive call is you pick up the phone, you tell somebody to sod off, and you put the phone down again, and you can get through thousands of calls. So people measure productivity without the first clue as to what it is. One more example on that, 'cause it spins off, and we'll come back to it later if you want to. I had this conversation with one of the big four consultants, and they were saying, well, we measure productivity by how much time people spend with a client, face-to-face time, and then how much money they bring in. And they thought about the call center example, and they thought, they said, to be fair, face-to-face time is probably a function of how good the PA is, and how much money people bring in is probably cherry-picking by people further up the organization. So people talk about productivity, and they don't know how to measure it.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that type of conversation quite a few times, certainly in the workplace area, where I think there is this productivity is quite nebulous. It's almost very difficult to quantify, let alone measure. And I think that's, for me, is why I think a lot of organizational leaders are reaching for mandates and counting hours and days in the office, because that's easy to count. You've got badge swipes, and I can see you're clearly in the office. So you're clearly doing a good job, Craig. You're at your desk. You're not, on your phone, kind of scrolling and doing anything else. Because of course, when we're in the office, we're 100% productive all of the time. So it's an interesting point, as you say, that idea of productivity is so different for each individual job, team, organization, I guess.
Yes.
What are some methods of measuring productivity in the hybrid workplace then, so that we don't fall into the trap of counting things that may end up like some sort of dystopian whack-a-mole?
What, methods that work or methods that people are doing?
Ooh, take it from any angle you choose. We'll cover both.
I mean, methods that people are doing don't work. None of them work. One of them is subjective productivity. They'll ask people how productive they are. It's utterly, utterly pointless. Productivity is an objective measure. It's like running a race. If somebody said, right, okay, Jane, how long did it take you to run that marathon, and you can't look at a stopwatch? You might go, 4 hours, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, clueless. And we're exactly the same with productivity. We do not know how productive we are until we measure it. So we get these horribly misleading stats. And a fairly common way that people will measure productivity, let's say a design house, and there's a top design house that measures it precisely this way. They'll say, Joe, we've improved your workspace. How much do you think your productivity has improved? And they'll say, about 10%. And they'll ask you the same question, Jay, and you'll say, I think about 4%. So they'll say, average 7% increase in productivity our stuff has produced. But people do not know how to do it. Now, we do. We spend a lot of time measuring, and it's to do two things. One, and people forget this, it's to do with the space in which people work and how they're managed. And secondly, it's to do with the elements of the job.
Yeah.
Now, again, let's just say that you, Jane, are a superb salesperson, and Joe, if you'll forgive me, you are not. So, Jane, you outperformed Joe in terms of sales, but we don't know whether you're working at full productivity or not. The company assumes you are because you're knocking out the park. Mm-hmm. Joe might be working at absolutely full capacity and top productivity, but again, he's not getting credit for that. So it's really important to look at the job, to look at the elements of the job that are important, and I'll come back to the accountants in a minute to illustrate the point, and to see the spaces that they're working in so you can compare what matters. So, for example, when you bear in mind that 70% of people leave a job because of an issue with management, the effect that management has on productivity is huge. And how often is that looked at? Hardly ever. Right? So let's just say we're looking at management, and we look then to go back to the accountants. We found that what matters to them is not the function done by the PA or the boss. It's attention to detail, information processing, and information management. Those are the things that matter to an auditor. So that's what we tested. And we tested those things under different circumstances. And by taking the conditions that they were in and improving them very slightly, we improved productivity across those pieces by 15%. Now that meant, or would have meant, an improvement in income coming into the organisation of £1.5 million on one floor for an organisation that includes hundreds of thousands of people, certainly tens of thousands of people across the globe.
Very interesting. So what is it? So there's the elements of the job that actually matter, and then there's the space, and then how does the leadership impact fit in with those parts?
let's go back to you as a salesperson and Joe as a salesperson. All right. And let's say I'm the manager, and I am an appalling manager, and I'm micromanagement, and I'm in your face all the time. Okay? The fact that you're performing well and Joe isn't means that you're seen as productive and Joe isn't. Right? Joe might be the kind of person that actually like, some people do, it's not rare, but some people actually like people to give them very strong strictures to where to go. And so Joe's responding really well to that, performing as he is. You, on the other hand, you're performing, let's say, 120% of target. But with me just backing off and being a laissez-faire manager, which is the most universally good manager, somebody who just leaves people alone, you could be working at 200%. But unless you test that, unless you've got condition A versus condition B, you're never going to know. Mm-hmm. So it's really important that when you experiment in the workplace. Yeah. And experiment means that you have one condition that stays the same, one condition that you fiddle with just on the variable in which you're interested, so you know what effect you're having. And almost nobody does that. And it's mad.
It's fascinating.
They'll just say, here's what we did first, here's what we've done afterwards. What difference have you done? We don't know. We don't actually know because we haven't kept one level as a control to see what the differences are. If you change everything from A to B, it could be that people are performing better or worse because the weather's changed, or because you've got new people, or because you've got a different intensive scheme. But if you change A to B in one, keep A to A in the other, then you can find out what the differences are and how to measure it.
And one of the, I think that you're touching upon, for me, a real fascinating question. And I've always really enjoyed, workplace itself as a concept, from a design aspect, and, always love walking through kind of offices and looking at what they've got, and, you always see new things, amenities and so on. And, it's that experience when you walk through, and I always imagine what would it be like to work here. And I suppose one of the holy grail questions I've always kind of asked myself, I've never really seen it answered very well, is does the design of this space improve the productivity? Because it's so difficult to, I think, first of all, understand, as you say, what is productivity, what is output, what does good look like, and then to actually measure that and to see what impact the workplace had on that. So could I ask you then, what examples do you have or have you seen where, for example, as you say, you might be doing an experiment to say we're going to refurbish one floor and leave the other floor exactly the same. What have you actually seen in terms of what moves the dial in that regard? Because I'd be fascinated to know.
Let's go back a little bit. Let's go back again to the big four auditors. There's quite a good example in there. Now, I certainly won't tell you who they are now because there's a story that comes out of this, and I'll tell you the full thing. They were a company, and still do, and they practice Six Sigma, which for people that watch this don't know, it's a system about making sure that there are no errors in what you do, which you think for an auditor is great. They don't make any mistakes, therefore you can really rely on them. And the Six Sigma style of workspace is a very Spartan, very minimalist space on which they spent an awful lot of money. An awful lot of money. So, as I said, we mentioned about increasing productivity. What we did is we looked at these spaces and we thought, we can improve it. So we flooded half of the space with £10,000 worth of plants. Unless the other half, the best condition, because you always want your own dog of war in the worst condition because you want to make sure it works, the best condition we're left in lean. And it was that half that we put in £10,000 worth of plants that produced a 15% increase in productivity, which is £1.5 million worth of extra revenue for £10,000 worth of plants. Because they couldn't measure productivity, they had no idea that was going on. They were doing what lots of organizations do, which is conflating cost saving with productivity. They're saying, we can save £10,000 that much more production by getting rid of the plants. Now, the really serious thing about this, and I found this fairly shameful, is that, and this is why I can't tell you who they are. This product, by the way, got published and was also on Channel 4, so we got quite a lot of publicity for this. But the company concerned wanted it buried, and that's why I can't tell you who they are, because they still sell Six Sigma at up to £25,000 a day for the people that go in for their top brackets, knowing that it's a suboptimal system. Make of that what you will.
Very interesting. You know what it reminds me of as well, Craig? I'm not sure if you remember this, but when ChatGPT first came out with the image generation, I was doing some kind of playing around and had a picture of an office, and I would just prompt to say more plants, more plants, more plants to get to the very end. And I think by the end it was like the office was in a jungle, and there were kind of animals running around the desks and so on. And I think you were commenting saying, yeah, more. So how many plants can 5,000, 10,000 pounds get you in a single floor?
We've had great fun with that, and we've tried that. We've flooded it. We flooded rooms with plants. We put one in. We put sticky plants in like cactuses. We put in Boston ferns and all kinds of leafy things. And there are two rules that don't just apply to plants, they apply to just about everything. The first one is if you enrich a space, and by enriching, you show people that you care about them, that's what it's about, you increase their well-being and their performance. So you can just put nice plants in, it doesn't really matter what they are. As long as they're nice and you choose them with care and people like them, that's just really good. And that's the sort of the biophilic approach, if you want. So you can put out, a nice bit of biophilic design. People like that, and the stats are absolutely right. It increases how healthy people are. It increases their mental health. It increases their well-being, and it increases their productivity, without any doubt, compared to the Six Sigma type space we spoke about before. But when you give people a choice of plants, they let them decide what they want, then you get better figures again. Now that in itself is quite interesting, because this minimalist Six Sigma, the lean style of space, is now a completely busted flush. It is demonstrously scientifically toxic. You wouldn't, for example, put a gorilla in a very lean cage, or even put an ant in a very lean Six Sigma type jar. You put sticks in. Right? You just would. But when we do that for people in offices, people win bloody design awards for it. For making an office like a zoo, people give them mixology awards and all the rest of it, and big rounds of applause. But it's nothing. That's the least you should do. When you empower people to make the space better, they always at least match and almost always beat the expensive design. Always. So, that's the point of enrichment. That enrichment is good, but it's the least we should do. But that's what we tend to applaud. It's empowerment. That's the real key. That's what makes the really big difference. And that's why we've got to fight to come back to what you do so well about hybrid. Because hybrid has a lot of empowerment imbued in it, almost as a natural thing. And that scares some people.
Yeah, it's like it's almost it's not really about the place as such, is it? It's more about autonomy. But why do you think this is? Does it boil down to state? When you're in the right state of mind to do the work, and you're feeling, when you're feeling appreciated and you sort of got a bit of energy about you and you feel, is it boiled down to that? Can we unpick that a bit? There's the one thing that you said about the biophilic approach, and there's the plants and everything else, which I guess is also a state thing. It feels a bit relaxing. It's a bit more natural, feels a bit more homely. And then there's also the element of choice and autonomy. And then there's the element of not being messed up by bad management.
Yes, there's all of that, and all of those are important. First of all, I've used plants a lot, to the extent that some people have called me the plant man, because I tend to use plants for enrichment and choice and all the rest of it. There is, despite what people want to say, there is nothing special about plants, nothing particularly special about biophilia. What is special is enriching a space and doing that with care, and plants are a very good way to do that, very inexpensively and very showily. But, for example, we worked in a hospital in Antwerp, and we used smell. And instead of the hospital smelling a hospital, it smelt of lavender. And people preferred the hospital. They thought the shops gave better value. They thought the relatives were getting better faster, and they thought the staff were awfully nice compared to the hospital. And it smelled. And we've used lots of things. We've used furniture and light, all kinds of things. Art is another really good one to improve enrichment and well-being. So that's the first thing. So that's the level you can do it. And then management itself has a massive influence. I mean, much more influence than the likes of plants and so forth. Because 70% of people leave their jobs because of some issue or other with management. Some issue or other. And a good manager makes a huge difference. And that good manager or leader, to step it to the top of the train, is somebody who provides what we call art, autonomy, resource, and trust. And every job in the world, any job you want to think of, depends on those three things. be it a professional, I don't know, a professional scuba diver, or somebody working in a call centre, or any of us, or the more autonomy, resource and trust you have, the better that job is. And those are the things that matter. And again, to bring that back to hybrid, there's a lot of those things imbued in hybrid. One of the resources where hybrid struggles is people, access to the people with whom you work. And that's why it's quite good sometimes to come into an office space and do some work. But what hybrid is also quite good at is gaining autonomy. And that's scaring an awful lot of companies who are now installing spy software on people's laptops with fairly disastrous effects.
Why do you think so many leaders just don't understand or look at or believe the science around this stuff? Because, we've known for quite a long time, haven't we, that autonomy matters to human motivation. It's like this fundamental need. Trust, very closely related to that. Maybe you could talk a bit to the relationship between trust and autonomy.
Again, this feeds into our post-COVID world. And again, the stuff that you're doing so well is that you have two types of manager that speak to this. You have the kind of manager that is open, and that thinks this is a good thing, we can let people work from where they want, we can empower them to do what they want, where they want, and that's good for the business. And we have the type of manager that dates back to the Panopticon, well, actually dates back to Josiah Wedgwood, who kick-started flexible, agile working and all of this kind of stuff, which put the manager in charge. And that was something that was, the ideas of that were reified by a chap called F.W. Taylor, who you may have heard of, with his Principles of Scientific Management. And Taylor is the person who has a direct route of influence through to Lean and Six Sigma, which influences so much space now. And that gave the manager hegemony over the space and over the people within that space.
The point I was going to pick you up on, Craig, so you mentioned around autonomy, resource and trust as being essential really for that kind of worker manager type of level. And then you were talking about, kind of how that led into Taylorism and the kind of scientific method, if you like, of observing your workers. And I suppose for me, the question I've got coming out of that is that obviously with those ingredients there, how much of the trust element do you think is severed or completely fractured and broken when that manager has said to the worker, look, you can come into the office once a week. Now it's twice a week. Now it's 3 times a week. Now it's 5 times a week. Do you think that once that trust is broken, it could ever be put back together again? Or do you think that is the kind of real cause of what Mark Mack calls the brain drain, effectively, the mandate leading to people just saying, the trust is gone.
That's a very good question.
You said one thing, now you're doing another, and that's it.
I mean, like everything else, trust is crucial to any relationship, wherever it happens to be. And the relationship you have with your manager is just as important at work. And trust is undermined by the more specious the behavior. And the example you just gave of slowly increasing the mandate to which people have to work is iniquitous. And that's the kind of thing that will cause people to to leave their jobs. That sort of behavior isn't on. The best way to handle hybrid working is to sit down and handle it with the people who are doing the working as a team. Some people say, well, we'll let people work from home 2 days, 3 days, whatever it happens to be a week. The best form is the one that suits the team. And the manager is part of the team and shouldn't be excluded from the discussions, but it needs to be a team decision that everybody buys into. And when the people buy into those decisions, I'd say almost always, I've actually, in my experience, never known them fail. It's sometimes a bit of a bug, excuse my language, to get people to agree, but they always do. And when that team decision is reached, it's a compromise. That's how these things tend to be, but people buy into them and they work. And that gets away and it gets around things like, for example, the midweek hump. Because part of the issue that people need to solve is how do we run the office best? Not this is what management expects, but how do we run the office best? What do you need to do your job well? How much support do you need in the office? When do you need to be here? Those kind of questions need to be asked, and not trying to fit people into this 5-day template that is increasingly out of date.
It does seem, I think, the idea of the so-called team agreements seems like a really sensible, pragmatic approach going forwards, and it gives the best balance, if you like, between the kind of the top-down mandates, which obviously just aggravate and I think frustrate people. But then management obviously want to see more cohesion. They want people to come in, to collaborate with their colleagues in person, and it does give a sense of structure. And every team is different, right? So if you've got a team of software developers, they'll probably say that, what's the point of me commuting into the centre of London to go behind a keyboard where I could be coding from wherever, from home, and be much more, to your point, productive. They can write, you can measure the amount of lines of code they create and how many scrum points that they achieve as a team. And so that the cadence of activity there is going to be very different to perhaps myself and Jane in sales and marketing, where we want to be a lot more collaborative and we want to perhaps meet with customers or meet with partners, etc. And so having a team-based approach makes perfect sense, because there's a team objective, everyone knows what they're trying to achieve, and it's really down to having that autonomy on that level. I think that's a really pragmatic approach, and it's good to see a lot of organisations are taking that type of way of thinking.
Yes, absolutely. It's a shame more people don't do it. And the reason lots of people don't do it is it threatens that managerial hegemony that's been in place for so long. Managers are so used to being in charge that they don't want to let go. And that's in spite of, if you like, the pre-COVID world being demonstrably suboptimal. They still want to drag people back to it because that's the world that they were in charge. And we have, and this is the reason why I'm so fond of what you people do, a really good chance now of creating a brilliant working environment where people can work in places that suit them, and companies can get more out of those people than they've ever had before. And it just takes a tiny change of perspective and some courage from organisations to go with it. And that's all it needs. And some people are doing it, and not enough are. And of the people that are making some change, it's about the enrichment in design, some of them are saying, as we said before, well, you can have some working from home, but we'll say when. And that is not as good as people saying, this is what suits us as a team best. It really isn't difficult, but it's emotionally hard.
It speaks to a wider issue with change management, in the sense that, I guess, traditionally, you've got change that is dictated from the top down. The leaders make the strategy and they push it down. They create all these plans and then they roll out communications to get buy-in from employees. And, the top down strategies, they're somewhat disconnected, I guess, from the workflow, and they slow organizations down, and they just make people feel angry and disengaged most of the time, because they're aware that there's almost being sold to. So I think as well that the speed is one thing that it almost does more harm than good. On the flip side of that, co-creating the change with employees seems quite a natural thing to do. And I guess with the rising complexity, that's another dimension to it. I mean, if you were in a slow moving, simpler world, you could think, oh, I've had my strategic thoughts in my ivory tower and I shall push them down. And then by the time everything got to the bottom, you could assume that not much had changed. Maybe you were right. But the chances of even understanding what the hell's going on in an organization now, and in the level of complexity and pace of change, technology, the competitive landscape, the speed of communication, hybrid work has got all that craziness of autonomy, meaning, lots of variability in when people show up and where people are and time zones. So you've got all this added complexity. And it seems quite intuitive that, in the more complex a system, the more you should be careful not to overestimate how much you understand it, or how much you understand your own actions as a leader, because to think that you've got it figured out and you know what to do is probably not the case. And you're just going to play whack-a-mole, that you're going to bash a problem down here with your infinite wisdom and see 20 more spring up over there that you didn't anticipate, that maybe actually go in the total opposite direction in terms of the emergent outcome that you were trying to fix in the first place. So it almost seems like there's something in the old wisdom of have the wisdom to know how little you know as a leader, and therefore devolve that decision making into to be a collaborative thing, not just collaboration and feedback, like, oh, give us feedback on these decisions we've already made, but actually co-creating the decisions with the people. I guess maybe logistically, is it a logistics problem? Do people not know how to do that with employees?
Well, I don't think that's a problem at all. What I'm sitting here thinking is, wouldn't it be very interesting if we run an experiment, and we just need a brave company to play with, where we compared a situation where managers said, this is how it's going to be, here's your mandate, where we had the in-between house, which some allegedly forward-thinking companies are going, where they allow people to work from home 2 days a week. That's your second condition. Then the third condition is you have the team saying, this is what will suit us best, and we think we work better this way. And you run an experiment, a proper scientific experiment, and see which works. That would seem to me to be the most equitable way of settling this particular argument. Science is a hard but about as fair a task element as you can get. It's called the modesty of science for a reason. Science doesn't find what it finds, doesn't care what it finds, it just finds. So we just want someone brave enough to do it. And then we'll test the management ideas, won't we?
Come forth, brave companies.
Yeah. So have you actually kind of done studies where you've looked at, for example, the home versus the office and what is quote unquote more productive? Is that something that you have done? I mean, how difficult have you found to get the results, obviously, given that people are outside of the office and, you can't be everywhere with everyone at the same time?
Well, I have, yeah. I started doing some research into home working properly. Obviously, hybrid's been knocking on for hundreds of years, but I started looking at home working as a longitudinal project during COVID, just to see how it affects people. And I've carried on looking at that, and I've looked at how people work at home and how people work in the office. And it's very upsetting for people that are on either side of the argument, because it doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of difference. There are pros and cons to both areas. If you say, here's I don't know, Alex, and Alex works in the office, and here's Chris, and Chris works at home, the way they work is roughly the same. There's not much difference. The element that matters is choice. That's what makes the big difference. And that's why hybrid, offering the choice, makes such a big difference. It's also why this enforced hybrid, the 2 days a week thing, is better than the mandate to the office, not because the office is better than home or home is better than the office, but because it gives that bit of enrichment, that bit of difference to the working style that encourages people to feel better about their work. And again, the company cares a bit about it. It's given us time to work from home as well. So it all speaks to the research we've been doing for 20 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, the part to me, I think that makes most sense is that, I was always a big fan of the activity-based working concept when I first came across it, I don't know, like kind of 10, 15 odd years ago. And this idea that you've got different work settings for different work activities resonated really well with me. And the way it was broken down is you've got, like, the first time I ever saw an office that had, the kind of these zones. There's a collaboration zone. There was a concentrate zone with like kind of quiet booths and it was like a library. And there was a communication zone, which had like VC equipment. I think they had a creativity zone as well with like whiteboards and so on. And then there was a range of desks in between. Like it was a place in Sweden. It was a technology company. It was fantastic. I was like, this is amazing. I've never seen so many types of desks. There's even one with a treadmill underneath one. I was like, I've never seen that before. I've never seen it since. But
I've got one under my desk right now.
There we go. But this idea of
gathering dust,
you break apart all the tasks and activities, and you say, well, what's the best horse for the course, right? And so then, for me, if you look at the office and the home now, you actually expand that view. For me, the home is your quiet space. It's for one-to-one calls. You've got hopefully the privacy, or a lock behind the door, and you've got the ability of taking that time writing a contract or doing a one-to-one or doing an interview. And then that leaves the office then for the collaborative, creative exercises where you want to ideate with the team, you want to get on the whiteboards, you want to build connections, build relationships that can then be sustained offline. So for me, the question is, it shouldn't be how many days in the office. It should be, what does your map of work look like? Break it down and actually apportion the amount of time and the location that best serves that type of activity. I mean, is that something that you've come across before? Like,
Yeah, I said there's quite a bit to run, but I want to rewind a little bit because you read a lot of good things. First of all, this multi-base activity style where you get a breakout zone and all the other kind of things. There was a brilliant architect, a chap called Eric Veldhoorn, who developed a space in the Netherlands called Interpolis, which people may or may not have heard of. And Interpolis had all such spaces as breakout zones. They had these beautiful leafy areas for people to sit and concentrate. They had a red sort of womb-like room that Veldhoorn decided that's where people could concentrate best, and all these kind of things. And it's not very good. All the breakout areas and stuff, it's that halfway house again, which people think is best practice. Give people what they bloody well want, not what people think they want. The problem we have with all design is that it thinks aesthetics is important. They're not. It's the effect of the space that is important. And you're only going to understand that by talking to the people that work there. So all things like the Sterling Award, they're going to the wrong places. They're going to the prettiest places, not the best places. And Veldhoorn, brilliant though he is, his idea, well, I asked him the question once, well, what about people's input? And he said, well, you need experts to show them the way. He's not a bloody expert. He knows sod all about people, but he knows about space. He needs leading by the nose, not the other way around. When you have the designers being led, not led design, you get a fabulous space. Because we spoke before about how empowerment is better than the design. When you actually make design let's use the word submissive for the time being, but you incorporate it in the team, when you empower but don't consult, then design starts to do absolutely wonderful things. And then it's really worth the money that you pay for it. So that's the first thing.
But just pausing there for a second. Sorry, I just wanted you to paint a picture of that, because that sounds very cool. You know, that concept. But how does that work on the ground?
Yeah, quite easily. We may talk about surveys later on, but the idea of consultation is a bit of an anathema in many ways. When people consult, what they mean is they send out questionnaires, they ask people lots of questions, then those ideas come back to management or design, and they put what they think on top of those ideas and then give it out. We have consulted with the workforce. When you're brave, then you say, well, I tell you what, we're going to let you, work team, develop your own space, and here's a designer to play with. So the designer says, well, I think we should have A, B, and C, right? And you go, nah, don't really like any of those. But I quite like that a bit of B, that would work for us. And how about that bit from C there? Yes, says designer, we could do that. And then the designer, well, why don't we do this to marry those two together? And the team goes, that's absolutely fantastic. And you're doing that. And the idea stays with the team, then you get a fabulous idea. Because the reason that team spaces work is that teams buy into them. There's no such thing as a perfect space. And if the three of us, for example, designed our own space, and you compared that to a Sterling Award-winning space, ours would look bloody awful, but it would work better. So when you then take that space and put design into it as a led element, not a leading element, you get wonderful things. And by wonderful things, I mean things like, compared again, we always use this sort of Six Sigma Lean as our control. Compared to our control condition, which is considered best managerial practice in many places, we're getting increases in mental well-being of 65%. We're getting increases in creativity approaching 40%. And we're getting productivity increase of about 35%, which beats anything we've done anywhere else. Whereas if you put design in on its own as this skilled element, the kind of space where people are making the spaces as a designer, you're getting half of those figures. Still much, much better, but nothing more than this human zoo that wins all the awards. It's great fun. Wow. Huge fun.
There's a question I'll ask you on that side then, Craig. So I think that what you've painted there, I think is quite interesting, really. And often, you know, you can have an architect or a designer that comes in and, you know, they put their vision or what they think is their vision or what they think is the client's vision, you know, kind of to life. Or there's someone who comes in, as you say, as consults, kind of understands the culture, the needs, the requirements of the people who are going to use that space for 5, 10, 15 odd years, however long it's going to be used for. And they really try to embody that. So can you give an example, specifically of a building you feel that has absolutely nailed that led design aspect, where they've properly consulted the people and they've come out with something that is just almost a physical embodiment of the organizational culture? I mean, is there a specific building, particular organization, or even a floor somewhere you've been where you said that is absolutely 10 out of 10, or has that not been achieved yet?
Yeah, I'm not saying that. Well, two things. First of all, it hardly exists. It really doesn't. No companies do this. There's not a company that does it. There are companies that say they do, but it's always the fact that the designer comes in with, here is our nth drawing and our Qth revision, and lo, look what we have done for you, no matter how empowering they say they are. But there was a project with which I was involved at the University of Exeter in their innovation centre, and that was a true lead design project. And that worked rather well. People really liked it. It's still being used, and people respond to it well now. And the beauty of it is, of course, because it's led design, it's led by the people in the space, and they know that they can change it as and when they want. And that's a really powerful feature. When you have that kind of facility to change a space, people don't very often. It's just knowing that you can that's really important. Like at home. You have, which actually, there you are. There's a good example. Your home. You get people in to decorate your home. You get people in to maybe furnish your home. And you use their ideas to inform what you want. So you might be utterly rubbish, say, but you're getting people that know about colours, that know about furniture, that know about paint. And because you listen to them and they listen to you, what you get is a design that suits you, that you like, that is much better than you would have come up by yourself. Now, not enough people in business do that. University of Exeter didn't deserve a lot of credit for it, but it's a really tough thing to do. And if it's hard to get managers to go one step beyond best practice, to get them to go 3 steps is almost impossible. So that's why something like, to go back to our experiment again, would be so good. Because you can do an experiment which is safe, but you can do an experiment that is really good. You can say, well, look where that's going to take you, mate. And then go down that line, and then you can do a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, and suddenly you're millions of pounds ahead of your competition and much happier staff ahead of your competition.
One thing that's sparking to me when we're thinking about this led design concept, employee involvement in the design and that sort of ownership over it, is in a hybrid work environment. Sometimes we're assuming that people just use whatever space. They'll just have to show up and they'll just have to grab what they can, which maybe isn't going to work so well. It almost seems as if what you're saying will work better if people are coming back to at least the same area, the same neighbourhood. Having some continuity in who's using particular areas of the office would be a really good thing.
Yes, I think so. I think to lead on from that, Jane, that's a very good point, is when you have team neighbourhood and team whatever, whenever we've worked with different organisations, we've never gone in and said, right, you must give people a la carte access. It's always table-d'hote stuff. So when you look at neighbourhoods, again, I better not mention the company concerned, but it's a large motor manufacturer, large global motor manufacturer. And they had 4 corporate colours, and they were brown, cream, green, and blue, basically. Those are the 4 colours that they wanted. And whether you were in, I don't know, Bangalore or Birmingham, they wanted you to know that you were in one of their factories or offices. And that was it, right? So the table-d'hote that we suggested, there's the template, there's your colour template that your team and their team and any team can choose from. You can have all cream, you can have brown and green, have whatever you want, but that's the template. So you know it's your colour, but you've got some variation within it. And that's a fairly tight remit, and that gives you your team. And some people will go and should go a lot further than that. And then we go down to what we were speaking about before, about how are people managed. And that's when you start to make a real difference.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, just want to kind of delve into that a little bit more. So where I've seen organisations certainly over the years that went from fixed assigned seating, i.e. one person to one desk, into shared seating, the easiest, most straightforward way was to have this team neighbourhood. So it was kind of our space, not my space. Right. And it was down to the team leaders and the team itself to almost kind of put their imprint on the actual physical aspect of the zone itself. And there was a consulting firm, again, I won't name, but they would have kind of lime green kind of dotted around everywhere. So no matter where you were, if I was in, say, like their office in New York or in London or in Shanghai, when I went there, they all had the same kind of little specks of paint and look and feel, but they were very unique and different in their own right. And what they were trying to do was to say, well, it's a shared brand, but it's our organisation together, and then almost kind of allowing the team to put their own stamp on things, to kind of bring, whether that was kind of create artwork or photos and so on, or this kind of to create this camaraderie. And I suppose that was a real great example of, if you like, we're not taking your desk away, we're giving you this to share. And what that meant was there was a much more better connection to the space itself. And I just thought that was a fascinating observation.
I think that's absolutely fair. It feeds in, Joe, what we're talking about. The more choice you give people, the more say you get in what they do, the happier they are. And, companies traditionally, and still do, almost always infantilize the people that work for them. Some people infantilize them very nicely. We can have beer on Friday, children. We can do that. And we'll put you this little sort of sandpit in. You can play in there. And if you're good, you can have a bit of flexi work. We'll allow us. That's very nice. And you get some people that are horrible parents. So we're going to monitor you every inch. We don't trust you, you bunch of bastards. But it's still very parental. What very few people do is say, well, look, we're all grown-ups. Off you go.
Why is it, Craig? Why is that? Why is it so normal to infantilise your
back to Taylor. All the ideas of Taylor, he took I'll give you a wrong stat, by the way. It's not 99.6% in 1864 were male. It's 96.4%. In 1864, 96.4% of all. Anyway, Taylor took the power that the clerks had, stripped the jobs. Well, he didn't. I mean, let me be accurate. The people that followed Taylor, because Taylor worked in a steel mill, the people that followed Taylor copied what he'd done and stripped complicated jobs in offices into simple jobs like typing, like filing, like sales, like marketing, individual things that managers could suddenly get their hands on. So managers took what we now call the helicopter view of everything going on, and they had that, and they really liked it because that put them in charge. Didn't have to run to the clerk, say, what are you doing, who's doing what? They knew and they directed it. And they have not let go of it yet. And that's the big thing, to go back to hybrid again, where people want people in the office because that's where they can control them best. And they can control them benevolently or maliciously. It doesn't really matter, but they still want to control them. That's where it comes from.
I think you're absolutely spot on there. I think that there's a big driver around that control side. And when I think of Taylorism, I think of almost like a David Brent style kind of wandering around and poking in, what are you doing, or perhaps something that someone mentioned to me I think last year now was that the Walt Disney approach of the walking around, like as like a management style where the manager would just walk through the office and what are you doing, and take that kind of interest in what's going on. And I think for some of those managers who have spent their whole careers in the office doing that, suddenly it's like a Dilbert comic almost, where the manager's in the office, like no one's here, so who can I manage? I'm therefore no longer a function, or I don't have any capability or power or control. So I wonder how much of it is reaching for the mandate button for the control and the need to get their claws in almost to what they're managing.
Now then, Mr. Harris, here's a hypothesis for you. We don't need as many managers as we've got. We don't need nearly as many managers as we've got, because people are quite good at managing themselves, and managers generally get in the way and aren't necessary. So if we had the kind of system that we're talking about, we have a whole cadre of people who are essentially useless. These people that are mucking up jobs for so many other people, the people that have gone off to get their black belts in Six Sigma, the people that have learned how to do lean, all those people that are NLP practitioners, all of this kind of stuff, they're just a waste of space. But if we got rid of them, this is science, right? If you're not the NLP, they're just useless. But Six Sigma and black and lean, they're toxic. If you got rid of the people that did that, all these thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that practice it, business would be better. So what do you do with them?
So we have to ask ourselves in a way, what is the point of management? Do we even need management? Is it that we're in an era of complexity that just requires leadership, which I guess would be more like trying to paint a clear picture of where you're heading so people can decide for themselves how best to get there, and then paving the way for employees to co-create the strategy, co-create the implementation of that, including the design, including deciding for themselves. how they work. I guess one thing that occurs to me is that when you have a leader who is very, very afraid of letting go of control on the basis that they just fundamentally believe people can't be trusted, it strikes me that perhaps the reason for that is that they've been in a culture, or they've maybe created a culture in which the systemic behaviors are not trustworthy, and therefore it's like self-reinforced for them that people can't be trusted, but whereas actually that's probably quite a systemic situation rather than anything that's actually true about individual people.
Quite. People buy into the system that they believe in. I mean, and we go again, Lean, Six Sigma. People don't do that because they think they're going to muck up the organisation. They don't do that because they want to depress well-being and increase stress. They do that because they think it's a genuinely good thing. And you can go back to McGregor in 1960, who talks about theory X and theory Y. And theory X is, as we've spoken about before, you don't trust them. You don't trust them, you monitor the hell out of them. And that is a school of philosophy that you can make logical sense out of. You know, I'm an untrustworthy person, Joe's very trustworthy, but I could well muck up Joe. So your job as our boss, Jane, is to come down on the pair of us and make sure there's nothing going on that could possibly affect Joe and get rid of me as quickly as you can. And that still believed in. And nobody mucks at their organisation. When I started all this, I thought Lean would work because it's been knocking around since Josiah Wedgwood. Now, I looked at it and I thought, great, Nobel Prize here. This is going to be fantastic. It doesn't work for any other animal species that exists, but it works for people. But it doesn't. It's just as useless for us as for anybody else, so we're still stuck with it.
I've not heard McGregor's Theory X Theory Y since it was GCSE Business Studies. I've not heard that mentioned since, and that was decades ago. I'm not going to say how many years it was because it would show my age, but it was. I remember at the time it was all around the theory of management and the types of workers that you'd have. And what I remember from it was you'd have, again, I might get this wrong here, but I think X was kind of like those ones where they won't do any work unless you're oppressing them and you're sitting on top of them and you're micromanaging them, etc.
Whipping them.
And then the theory Y was those that just need to be empowered and free, and almost kind of the laissez-faire approach works really well. And so it was around as a manager, kind of with your workforce, etc., trying to identify, is this someone who I need to micromanage to get the best out of them, or do I just need to set them free and let them get there? And I've not heard that mentioned for years.
I'm very impressed by your recollection of school stuff, Joe. That was pretty good going. It reminds me a bit of, is there not Theory O and Theory E as well? I think there was, something, maybe it was Harvard Business Review or something, but there's a stat that something like 70% of change projects fail.
There are quite a, and all of those, there's a guy called Peter Drucker at the same time, and this probably goes back a bit, you probably heard of Peter Drucker too, and he brought up the idea of the knowledge worker, and the knowledge worker speaks quite well to the theory Y, to the sort of, I don't know, the IT worker of today, the person who makes knowledge pay. They make money from this rather than pulling levers and putting things on production lines. That's the knowledge worker, and the knowledge worker works best under theory Y, which is true. But the knowledge worker works even better when the knowledge worker gets on and does what the knowledge worker wants to do because he knows what's best. And the manager, while I think about it, it's not the manager's job to dictate. The managers go back to what the manager should be doing, which is facilitating. That's a manager's job. So the manager facilitates what the team wants, not tells it what to do.
Yeah, I mean, I've read something, I think it was only just this morning, where the role of the manager isn't to be a force, but to be a force multiplier. And so the idea being is that, you're again, if you use a football manager analogy, that the football manager isn't on the pitch, but they are the ones that have to set the strategy, the tactics, and have to win the game to get the result. And they can't just run on the pitch and take a penalty or something like that. It's just not the way the games work. So it's I suppose, very difficult to do that. You've got to have that understanding of the players in your team and how do you get the best out of them to get that outcome.
It's very good.
I think I remember something about Drucker saying that that you get organizations that are traditional organizations that are very much designed for continuity, and then you get change leading organizations that are designed for change, constantly innovating, and therefore, but he said that those change leading organizations actually need more continuity. I think he's something like, changing and continuity are poles rather than opposites, because the more that you need to be geared up for continuous change, the more you need to actually balance that with the things that have that continuity, so that people kind of feel secure and that they know what to expect. And those are the sorts of things like the values and the vision and the rules and those big people-y things. So I guess if you're a change leading organization, and you can see that, the organizations that are really advanced with hybrid work, that have autonomy as of course, and that naturally they're more values driven, they're more people orientated, obviously, and they tend to perform better. It's almost like it's I don't know what the causation is versus the correlation, but there's definitely a type there, isn't there? Very, very solid continuity in terms of values and how you treat people, and that almost allows for this adaptability and innovation and culture creativity that will mean that you actually can change just continuously, because the people will just do the stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliantly made point, Jane. That's absolutely superbly, because you talk about change and continuity. You have if you haven't got a continuity of people, you can't have the change, because you need a consistent strand of people who are implementing the change for that to happen. So I think that's a beautiful point. Yeah, absolutely. I've forgotten about that. Yeah, absolutely bang on.
It's like the organizations that have something to stand for.
It's really important. And people talk about culture quite a lot. And people hopelessly misunderstand culture. People say, this is what our culture is going to be. Well, you think so, do you, mate? Well, it probably isn't. Because culture is a bottom-up thing. You cannot, we're a board of directors. We can't say this is our company culture unless we're the only people in the company, because then the culture is ours, which is why companies that grow find the culture changes, because they can't control as much what goes underneath. We can seed the culture, though. And if we're a considerate management team that empowers and gives people resource and trust, you can bet the culture that follows us will be very positive and very good. Whereas if we're not, if we're fairly autocratic, and we're, to go back to the point that you were making earlier on, Joe, about the manager that changed his mind about how he can come into the office, we do that kind of stuff, you can bet our culture is going to be fairly rancid. But we certainly can't set it as an organisation. We can do things like make all the mission statements, but that doesn't mean a whole lot. And the point about Drucker is beautifully made, and it feeds into what Joe was talking about earlier about the different styles of management, because that will directly influence how, for want of a better word, good an organisation is in all senses.
What is culture?
Culture is one of the defining parts. You can't not have culture. It's like identity. It's one of these strands of psychological awareness that everybody has. Everybody has a culture. Society has a culture. A country has a culture. An organisation has a culture. And it is the defining part of what it's like to be within that organisation. Is it a kind? Is it autocratic? The nature of the beast. And a culture is an amoral, let's just keep with the word entity, it's an amoral entity that defines what's going on in part or in all of that organisation. If you have a universal culture, then everybody buys into it. And again, it can be amoral. I worked a long time ago, I was doing my master's, and again, I bet I missed a company, with a financial organisation that sold pensions. And I didn't realise how horrible it was. I didn't know that when you bought a life insurance policy, the first 13 months you pay go straight into the salesman's pocket as commission. I didn't know that. But this organisation had that. And the culture of that organisation, its defining culture, was that it was an avaricious thing. And you had to be a hard person to work there and not care awfully much about the people that were there. You provided the pension that suited them or the pot that they wanted, and then you took them as legally as possible for as much as you could. If you didn't fit into that culture, you were burnt off. So to change that culture to something good would be very hard. We can talk how to do it, but you can do it, but you might not want to. That culture works for them, and that's how they made the money. Or you could get a kind, caring culture. Again, the culture is the driving soul of the organisation. Let's try and think of an organisation. Let's think of the BBC. There's a good one for a culture, which tries to be, and people kick and fuss all the one, as impartial as it can. Now, you have a look at the BBC and what it has got, it hasn't really got a left-wing bias, hasn't really got a right-wing bias. What it tends to have is a young liberal bias, because that's what a lot of people that work there do. But they do try to be as impartial as they can. And that is something that matters to the people there. And people buy into that culture and it attracts them. It's like this totem of what makes people stand. And that is, you can argue, probably quite a good thing to be as impartial and as rigorous as you can be. Your company will have a culture. If you work on your own, you have your own culture. And you can also negotiate a culture. If the two of you work for the one organization, if you are just Hubstar, you will negotiate a culture and it will have something that represents the pair of you, but doesn't have either of you as a complete whole. It will be part Jane, part Joe. How much? Depends on the negotiation. So it represents everybody. It draws on the identity of people. And if you start to impose a culture from the top, what you get is the culture of the top, because the board can set its own culture, at loggerheads with the culture that bubbles up from underneath. And that's the very definition of them and us.
I mean, that concept of culture being the shared identity is great. And it reminds me of a story, actually. At the most recent roundtable we hosted in London, there was someone who was working in insurance, and he was describing how his son was going through work experience. He had his first experience at the age of 12 or 13 in an office, and he kind of met everyone in the office and made all these connections, and came back. And he said, "How was it, son?" He said, "It was brilliant. He was absolutely buzzing. Like, he was jumping, like really excited, really charged up, and he couldn't wait to go back the next day." And so he said, "Look, son, that's what culture is. You've experienced shared culture. That kind of feeling of, meeting new people, creating those connections." And someone had commented that I think it was along the lines of, if you've got a friend at work, you're 70% more likely to stay for the company. And that's really important to that shared belonging and shared culture, because if you've got kind of people that you really enjoy spending your time with and enjoy working with, you're much more likely to thrive there. And that, to me, is really important for how you try to cultivate the high performance culture. It can't be, in my opinion, created. I think it's got to be curated. It's got to be kind of well seasoned. It's got to be kind of well nurtured in that sense. So I thought it was a fascinating example. But your answer of shared identity, I think that's pretty spot on.
Yeah, that's absolutely. I mean, the idea of identity is fairly key. We said before, you can't help but identify. You might identify as, I don't know, Scottish. You might identify as a football fan. You might identify as a parent. You might identify as an employer of one company. We all have many, many identities. And when you go to an organisation and you're getting along well, that tends to mean that you're buying into potentially the organisational identity or potentially the team identity you work with. Ideally, you want both. Because if you get congruent identity, where the team identity and organisational identity go together, then that is the very opposite of them and us. That's just us. And when you get that, you've got a really good organisation. So yeah, bang on.
Yeah, that must be quite rare in a way, because I think a lot of people live with a cognitive dissonance that they may be, but they may be like microcosms of culture in which they feel aligned, but it's hard to get everything to align. I guess could we is it just the leader's responsibility, or do leaders get sort of systemically molded into into the beast, or is it the responsibility of the leadership?
Right. No, leadership is a different thing again. Leadership, a bit like culture, is one of the most misunderstood things in business. People will, for example, the idea of the great leader being born is still very extant in business. Jane is just a born leader. Rubbish. Leader is contextual. And the point about leader, and one of the best there's a book written by, Alex Haslam and Steve Reicher. It's on leadership, and I commend it to everybody. It's superb. And the best form of leadership is prototypical leadership, because people forget about followership. You can't lead unless you've got people to follow. And if the followers don't buy into what you're doing, then it's an utter nonsense. One of the best examples is probably Churchill. Churchill was absolutely no leader of any kind whatsoever in the 1930s. He was this nutter on the back benches cursing Gandhi and cursing Hitler, who'd bust his flush at Gallipoli and nobody took him seriously. He'd made a mess of the Great Strike, made a mess of the gold standard, made a mess of Ireland. He was bloody useless. Nobody's any notice of Churchill until Chamberlain failed. When they said, hang on, said all the followers, this guy's been banging on about Hitler and the Nazis being a danger since the early 30s. And suddenly he became prototypical of what the country wanted and became one of the greatest leaders this country's ever seen. Purely on prototypicality. That's what defines a leader.
And he said quite famously, history will be kind to me for I shall write it, which so many quotes really you could pull out of Churchill really. It's funny actually, you think of kind of, leadership in that sense, and I suppose, you think of Churchill, you think of, the kind of the war years and the speeches and, what he did. But obviously there was quite a few chapters, as you said, you've referenced quite a few really running up to that, which were not so illustrious and not so
glamorous
really in that sense.
No, and his second term in office, he voted back in after Attlee. I mean, I know he was a very old man. He was 77, I think, when he came back in for his second term. But might as well not have been there. He was pointless. But during the war, he was precisely what we wanted, because he was the embodiment of he was prototypical of how Britain wanted to see themselves. He was the embodiment of patriotism. You had Mosley, who was the embodiment of nationalism, and everybody hated that. And Churchill was the embodiment of what people saw as patriotism, and everybody was able to buy into it. And he was undoubtedly superb at it.
I think for me though, it was the words that were said and how they were said at that point in time. Like you could listen to the speeches now and almost kind of the hair goes up at the back of your neck when he talks about, never before has so much been owed by so many to so few. And what that actually meant, what the words actually meant at that point in time was just incredible, how he had a way of saying, such complex things in words. And that to me is leadership in terms of what is charisma. It's around kind of words and actions and deeds that inspire people towards a shared goal. And so you can pull out hundreds of his quotes and speeches that were driving towards that one goal of in that moment in time. And that to me is in that moment, one of the greatest leaders I think will probably ever produce in these islands.
There's two things that stood out in everything you guys just said. The first thing is that I love that idea that you're kind of a leader if people follow you. So you might have a leader that's trying to do leadership stuff, but if nobody actually buys what you're doing, then you're not really a leader. And I guess that's when there's probably a high, I'd like to think, I don't know if there is a high correlation between leadership competence and people wanting to follow you. Because otherwise, if people don't want to naturally, I guess you have to force them. That was one thought. And that's where the bad leadership behaviors could creep in. So either on the polls there, you've got the sort of leader who nobody wants to follow and therefore uses force. And then you've got leaders who people want to follow. They might even not want to be a leader or tell people what to do, but they just happen to be the right person in the context. And then the other part of the contextual thing that's interesting, it reminds me of a book called Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. And he talks about the evolution of organizations and leadership and how it's correlated with worldview, which is, so, if you're in the tribes and gangs and you're in this dangerous place, obviously a certain type of leadership can be pretty good, versus if you're in a safer or more complex. And he talks about the evolution of, from tribal times through different eras, and how most organizations are kind of these days designed for, performance, and, they then move in towards that sort of family model. And then the ultimate evolved ones will be what I think Lulu calls teal, which is very much the self-managed organizations. So I guess for the context, there's the right type of organization and therefore the right type of leader. And then there's also that idea that maybe if you lack the skill in the context to have followers follow you of their own free will, then maybe that's something that create bad behaviors in leaders that are in the position where they're not doing it?
Well, the psychology is bang behind you in terms of context. Absolutely. The more contextual you are, the more you reflect the context in which people find themselves. To go back to what we talked about before, be it moral or amoral, people will follow you. I mean, you talk about Churchill, there are people on the other side of the argument who are also people to whom the flag was waved and people flocked towards it. But there are different styles of leaders, and some are divisive and some aren't. And a divisive leader will attract some people, and they will be the followers for that particular person, and then others won't. I mean, whether people love or loathe Margaret Thatcher, I think everybody can agree she was very black and white. People either loved her or loathed her. And some people aren't black and white. Some people are grey. You take almost any other politician and you'll get a shrug of the shoulders. Very few people shrug their shoulders when you talk about Margaret Thatcher. But if you talk about, I don't know, let's say, Harold Wilson, you talk about Ted Heath, people like that, you talk about Tony Blair even. People have very strong opinions most of the time, but there is an element of, and it depends on that particular person and on the situation in which they're in, as the level of followership. And when you talk about people like Thatcher, of course, you then get into the idea of the Ryan Glass cliff and women being appointed to leadership positions in times of crisis and unusuality. And so there are all kinds of factors that feed into why people become leaders. But followership is always the key one.
So I guess in today's hybrid world, where all the science is pointing towards the important thing being choice, and actually maybe we're barking up many wrong trees when actually we could almost boil it down to choice, autonomy, trust, resources, the art acronym that you used. So I guess the broadly speaking, if you can generalize it, the most appropriate style of leadership today for that type of high autonomy organization in a very complex context would be someone very high in trait openness, someone very confident in their ability to paint a picture of the end game that's like compelling, and then have the self-awareness to let go and not wreck your team. And so there seems to be, I guess you could generalize it. I think you can probably generalize it to that extent now, that, high trait openness, high people who allow autonomy are going to be more successful in you'd think, in today's hybrid world.
Yes, I mean, any job, it goes back to art, autonomy, resource, and trust. The more managers devolve those things, very simply, the better the people enjoy their job, the better they'll perform, and the better they'll feel. It might help to know that when we monitored people from home, we can crudely, I suppose, talk about three types of managers. And there are three types of managers, and this developed during COVID and has stuck around ever since. And you have the "how are you" manager that phones up and says, "Well, how are you doing, Joe? Are you all right, Jane? Anything you need? Anything that we can help you with?" Then you get the laissez-faire manager, which is, I'm sure they get on all right by themselves. If they need me, they'll give me a call. That's all right. Just sit back. And then you get the "where are you" manager. Where were you yesterday afternoon, Jane? And why are you looking at Facebook at the moment, Joe? Why are you doing that? Why aren't you where you should be when I expect you to be here at 9:30 in the afternoon? Why were you picking up the kids yesterday at 4:00? Why can't your partner do it? So you've got the how, the laissez-faire, the where are you, the why aren't you where you should be type of manager. And what we found is that the where are you manager, compared to just the ordinary laissez-faire and the how are you manager, depresses happiness by 30%. People are 30% unhappier. And that depresses how productive people are by 25%. Or to go the other way, ordinary, you don't have to be massively happy, you just have not to be unhappy. Those people are performing 31% better than the people that are under the cosh from this, the micromanagement style, the where are you stuff, that put the monitor on the computers. So you spoke about the link between autonomy and trust. It's about that level of trust that people give in that particular instance that is a really major demarcation point.
So in that scenario, Craig, where you've got those clear results there, the where are you manager depressing their team, dragging down performance 30%, you put that report in front of said manager. Is it possible to actually change that style, or is that simply the nature of the person itself? What was the reaction when you put that report in front of?
Hey, listen, I've got to manage like that. That Harris character, you can't trust him. You've got to watch him, or he'll slope off and skive. You might think it's 30% down. If I didn't do that, it'd be 60% down. It's just self-justification. That comes back to the need for experimentation. But I can't say you're wrong, because there's no A versus B. We don't know. So that's why experimentation is so key, because I say we go back to Josiah Wedgwood for some of this stuff. And if management has believed this is right for 250 years, me just say, well, I've been looking at this little bit with COVID, looking at 1,100 people, that's not going to sway many. That's not going to sway them. You need an experiment under the nose. Says, well, here you go, try that. And we've been successful with this research that we did around about 2010-ish, because that's informed a lot of biophilia and empowerment and all the plant stuff, and that's fed through quite well. But even then, people are still doing it their way and not letting people go their own. It's still the people that are putting the plants in. It's still the designers that want to have the control. But at least they're doing it in a way that's benevolent. But it works in any context. And we need to be able to say, look, you idiot, you manage like that and you're going to get a very poor outcome. All you need to do is do that and trust people to get on with it. And you have a much easier life, much easier people to manage, and the company does better. Which comes back, well, do you need that manager there at all? That's the question then. But there you go.
No, it's fascinating. It really is. I'll ask you a question as well, Craig. I've seen you obviously write a lot about the Night Index. What can you tell us about the Night Index? Is this the secret sauce that you use when you're kind of creating these types of, if you like, studies for organisations? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I put the Night Index in because I look at surveys that companies do, and they're ubiquitously not awfully good. If you never ask the question, so what, then the survey isn't awful. So, for example, let's just say that 30% of people in this company say their chairs are uncomfortable. 50% of people say the air conditioning isn't very good. 40% of people don't like their manager. Well, so what? And what that means, they open the doors to consultants to sort of interpret things as they want. And does it matter? Well, it might be totally fascinatingly crucial that 30% of people find the chairs uncomfortable, or it might be an erroneous fact that doesn't make any difference at all. But if all you've got to work on is a whole list of percentages and nothing else, then that survey is pointless. And what companies need to do is to be able to model data. So it requires very complex statistics to produce easy to understand models rather than sheets and sheets of percentages that mean naff all. And that's all I've done is I've put a scientific survey and developed a scientific survey so we can model organizational data and find out, for example, these people, this team, this Jane and Joe team, they're stressed. Well, why are they stressed? We'll find out what elements of stress are the problems. It might be working too long, and what's causing it. And we can trace it back through well-being, through identity, to autonomy, resource, or trust. And we can find out precisely what makes the difference. So we can then fine-tune stuff. And that's what everybody should be doing. But instead, they're just after raft of percentages, which mean naffle. So that's what the Night Index does. It's there to provide crucial answers to what's going on in key organizational variables and to improve things as and when necessary. And to put those levers into management hands. So instead of saying, well, that Harris character can't be trusted, Young's all right, but I'm still not sure she's quite good enough to get on, you can know what to do to make them feel better and perform better. That's it.
That's fantastic. And does this give you a way of benchmarking, if you like, kind of one organisation from another as well? So, organisation X being kind of 80%, this one is 60%, what's the difference there? And then does that give you then something then to go in as a consultant to say, well, this is what a high-performing organisation or workplace looks like, and these are the things you're missing? So do you find it's easy to quantify something?
Yeah. That's what we do. Benchmarking is really, really important because, if you go in and you say, well, we got these levels, that levels, and that level, so what? Well, the so what, mate, is you're 30% down compared to this company here. You're losing market revenue here, and you're probably missing out on £40 million turnover. That's the so what. And you go, And when you can tell people those kind of data, then you've got an interesting conversation, things you can put right. So benchmarking is really important. So yeah, thanks for raising that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose if that benchmarking is with, we've done this study at your competitor across the street and they're doing X, Y, and Z, suddenly you've got their full undivided attention at that point.
Yes, to be fair, we might not give them their competitor data because they wouldn't like us sharing theirs, but we can certainly talk generally about what's going on for sure. Yeah. And it makes it, and it's easy because it just follows the science. The science is really consistent. We have never found a place where people are too happy or too unstressed. Those things always correlate with better performance. And when you put people under the cosh and you make them unhappy, and you monitor them and you make them feel stressed, their performance goes down. It's universal, and it never is anything else. So it's not a difficult thing. In many ways, what I do is pretty straightforward. It's just getting organisations to be brave and taking the brakes off.
So one final question on this point before we perhaps speak of something else. What was the organisation that had the highest night index rating? Is there one, the one that's at the top of the tree, in your opinion, that scored the best?
I haven't asked their permission. I don't know if I can release the data. I can tell you it's a manufacturing organisation based in the northwest of England, and they have a very interesting situation with the night index. Their people are all really, really happy. And you normally get the pyramid that all this stuff is tough at the top. It's nonsense. It's always tougher at the bottom. At the bottom is where you get the stresses and heart attacks and people dying younger. That's at the bottom. But not in this case. This company is going out of its way so much to make their people feel good that actually their board are really quite stressed. So we need to do something about the board because they're looking after their people and not doing it themselves. So at the moment, we're going, well, okay, how can we keep this buff down the bottom where people are really well looked after, but how can we make your job easier? Because they're scoring massively for all the organisation, bar the 10 people that run it. And they're having a rotten time. So we're looking at them. I can't tell you the names. I haven't asked their permission. So.
No problem at all. But I suppose it's great to know, though, that, as you say, that, it must be very refreshing as a consultant to go in and, there's just an organisation that's just performing very well, and it's just a case of, yep, this all looks great, instead of where on earth do I start?
It's lovely. I'll tell you, I can give you one company that I can mention the name. It's a company I used to work with called Ambius, and we talk about empowering people in the workplace. All right, one quick story. And they took this, they've been working for a long time, and this is in Paris, and they said, okay, we're going to give all the people that work in this office a budget of nothing. But you can design the office just as you want. So they did. And I remember there's one woman there who was one of the managers, and she was a huge fan of the Moulin Rouge. So she had these sort of columns in the middle of the room, and she had feather boas around them, and the whole thing was pink. And there was another woman who was, I forget which manager she was, and she was a fan of going on safaris. So she had camouflage nets and all kinds of stuff, and that theme was carried on. They had, for example, a breakout room that they called the Moon Room, and that was black star cloth with these cream leather beanbags that looked like moon rocks. And they'd all done individual hand-drawn pictures of each other. So Joe, you would draw Jane, you would draw me, and I would draw Joe, and these pictures went up the wall. And they were bloody awful. but everybody really liked them there, and they all bought into this space massively. And it worked a treat. Worked an absolute treat. And it cost the company nothing. But for just trusting the people to get on and do it themselves, they got a huge reward out of it. So,
nice. There was one thing, Craig, that you had stats on being able to figure out how to increase intelligence. I thought that was very curious. I was like, how? How does that happen?
Well, we were doing some work with Somerset Care. There's another company I can mention. And Somerset Care taught me that people that look after older adults do actually a brilliant job, and it's just the exception that make the news. They're a fantastic organisation. But the issue that they had, and that every caring organisation has, is that you have to do to older people, because obviously they're fairly frail. So we go in and say you should empower people. Empowered people do better. And they wanted this kind of message in the care home where it's a very hotel-like model. But if you empower somebody who's 90 and very frail to make their own cup of tea, they pick up a kettle, wobble it, and scold themselves to bits. So how do we empower people? So we empowered people by letting them develop their own social space. What colour do you want the wall? Would you like some plants? Would you like some pictures? What would you like to do? Right? So we empowered them to develop their own space. With a control home down the road that just got on with it, with Somerset Care doing their own usual fabulous job of making a space better. So the normal way, and then this new empowered way where the residents were in charge. And to speak to the point we were making earlier about teams being awkward to come to an agreement, getting a lot of old people who are very, very set in their ways as to what they want was a nightmare at times. The rows were fantastic, but they did it in the end. And they decided on the colours and the paints and all the rest of it. And we tested various things. And one of the things was intelligence. And we used this test called the ACE-R, the Addenbrooke's Cognitive Exam Revised, which looks at how people are fading towards dementia. I forget the pass. I think it was 75%, but let's get a certain pass mark on that. And so this is a fairly key measure. Are people going to be classified as dementia or not? And we increased their intelligence by 19%. Now, from that, we thought, well, does that work at work? And it does. We can make people cleverer in space B than they were in space A. So you can make your own things. Now, the extrapolation that you can make from that is people are people. Adults are adults anyway, whether you're 18 or 80, the same kind of things apply. But if that applies to kids as well, that's very interesting, isn't it? If you could improve exam scores, now wouldn't that be interesting? You haven't done that. So psychology is wonderful. It's a fabulous science. And most of the psychology that we do is involved with how people interact. All we've spoken about today, be it culture or performance or anything else, is how people interact. And it's the interaction of those people that can be incredibly beneficial. The best drug you're going to get is working with somebody else. And it's also one of the most harmful drugs if it goes wrong. And when you get it right, it seems to improve everything. And we've improved not just intelligence, not just productivity, but creativity as well. All of these things we seem to be able to increase. So again, we can do this. And hybrid working, again, to come back to stuff that you do, has the capacity to be an agent to increase all of these things itself. Because it's the way that the world should be moving at the moment. And how it happens will influence how happy people are and how they perform. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm. It seems we're more in need of that than ever as well, given that, I think there's some pretty confronting data about the decline of mental health and the rise of depressive illnesses and anxiety. And I think I've seen these charts that show in 2012, it just plummets, especially for the younger cohorts, correlating with this widespread use of smartphones and social media. So work, not to put all the onus on companies and work to be able to sort of fix that problem, but it does seem like being able to be yourself and do your best work in an environment where you're trusted, where you have high autonomy, where you can co-create the space, just choice. It boils down to having choice.
Yes. Yeah, all of that's really important, but we do have a serious issue with mental health in this country, a very serious issue, and that is that it is just not regarded. What people I don't think realise is that anybody can set up as a counsellor, can set up as a therapist, can call themselves a psychologist. Right? People with no qualifications at all can be a psychologist, a therapist, whatever. You have people, mental health officers in organisations who know nothing about mental health at all. Zip. They're just promoted to that position from wherever it is, HR or marketing or whatever. Now, you wouldn't trust me. You wouldn't trust the person walking past either of your windows with a penknife and say, well, would you please take my appendix out? But that's what we're like. Our minds are so much more complicated than our appendix, but anybody can mess with them. Anybody can mess with them. And we wonder why it's such a bloody mess. And until we get really strict on people giving mental health advice who know what they're talking about, not people who are just emotional exhibitionists and want to talk about their own issues, proper medical people, We will never get over this hideous mental health crisis you've got at the moment. Never. And that needs to be done. So mental health is the fundamental area of business that needs to be addressed properly. And it's not difficult to get people in. I mean, there are lots of therapists about. Use them. And then we won't have this hideous crisis, and you mentioned the young cohort at the moment, whereby you've got lots of people kind of guessing what they think they should do. When actually treatment itself is relatively straightforward, and there's a lot of things we've been talking about today. You just say, well, how does it work for you best? What's the best thing we can do? And you tell us and then guide us. And then you get health professionals in who will help them with any particular issues that they've got. That's it. It's not hard. It's just really important. And that's what we need.
Well, one last thing I think it would be good to ask you, Craig, is there's going to be, I would imagine, some workplace leaders who are on the corporate real estate side or workplace experience, and they're facing all these big conundrums because they're looking at, how much space do we need? What type of space do we need? How do we get these results? What are your final thoughts that you would just put out there to those people in terms of advice or questions they should ask themselves or anything along those lines?
What we shouldn't do is put the real estate ahead of the people. There are two things going on in business when it comes to hybrid at the moment. One, people want people back in the office because they're worried about their hegemony. And the other reason is they're worried about the cost of the real estate that isn't being used. People are far more important and valuable than real estate. So the real estate needs to flex to what people require, which is why it's important that the people who provide that real estate should be flexible themselves. And the more flexibility they can put into that solution, and the more they can be led by the people that move into it, the better. That's it, really.
And on that note, thank you so much, Craig. I appreciate your time, and Joe as well, as a fabulous co-host. And it's a good time to have the conversation, and a lot of food for thought there in terms of, whether we're almost... we're doing more work than we need to do in many respects. A lot of managers are doing more work than they need to do. We're working a lot harder to decide what should be done rather than just maybe letting it happen, co-created with the people and evolving some of that. And so there's a lot of interesting things in there. Thanks
so much, Craig. And I've got to say the analogy of art, autonomy, resource and trust, I think that's something that is, for me, a big takeaway in terms of what's really needed for any type of organisation to get the most out of what they're doing, where they're going. So thank you so much for sharing so many great concepts and topics with everyone. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure, Bo. Thank you. I think it fits into your magnet, not mandate, quite well as well. So good luck to you. I think what you do is fabulous.
Really appreciate that. Thank you so much.